off as they are casually committing murder-suicide by plunging their planes, full of people, into the sea. It seems that it happens more often than you might imagine. You see, I was talking to this one old boy about John Kennedy's fuel valve, and he says,
"Yeah, that's mighty strange, all right, but strange things will happen sometimes, you know. But hey now, I know another strange fuel valve story. You know that guy in Egypt Air 990? He turned off the fuel selector valve."
And I said, "What?" And he said,
"Yeah. You know, there was that flight out of New York City, Egypt Air 990, 15 weeks after John Jr.'s crash. There was a plane full of Egyptian military people, and right after takeoff, one of the pilots walks into the cockpit and says something about Allah Akbar, and bang, he grabbed the controls, the yoke, the steering thingy, and he pushed it all the way forward, sending the plane plunging straight down towards the ocean. Well, there's about 5 other pilots standing around, and they all jumped on this one maniac and pulled him away from the controls. And then they started struggling, pulling back on their steering yoke, trying to pull the plane out of the dive. But the plane had gathered speed and momentum, and a big airliner doesn't want to turn very easily under the best of circumstances, and so these guys are really struggling. And so while all the pilots are occupied with trying to bring the plane out of its dive, the maniac simply turns around and pushes the idiot button and turns the plane's fuel valves to off, instantly killing the engines. Now, without engine power, a 757 is a hulking dead weight, and the plane simply continued its natural course, plunging into the sea, killing 217 people.
"Damn. Well, thank you, Professor. That's a hell of a story. And folks, that's just the beginning. Egypt Air 990 hit the water 50 miles from where John Kennedy Jr.'s plane went down. Now there's a coincidence for you. And I should probably mention, no one in Egypt buys this story. First, outside of military operations, Muslims don't commit suicide. It's just not part of their culture. Secondly, the family insists that he had nothing to be suicidal about. His family loved him, his career was solid, his life was good. So many Egyptians think that it's more likely that the plane was taken out by an Israeli missile in order to kill all the military people on board. But the black boxes were recovered, which not only recorded the sounds of the pilots' voices and the sounds of the struggle, but a second black box recorded the readings from all the gauges and the movements of any levers and instruments used by the pilots to control the plane, including the steering wheel thingy, the steering yoke, and the fuel selector valve. Well, there's a third explanation. See if you like it any better. According to this theory of what happened, the maniac pilot on Egypt Air 990 was a Manchurian candidate. He'd been hypnotized, programmed, brainwashed by some country's intelligence agency to kill himself and everyone else on that plane by pushing the controls forward. But most importantly for our investigation, this theory says he had also been programmed to then turn the fuel selector valve to off. He had been programmed to do it 3 months after someone on John Kennedy's plane did exactly the same thing. What do you mean programmed? Hollywood has made 2 movies in the last 40 years with the title The Manchurian Candidate. Both movies tell the story of individuals who have been programmed through mind control techniques to murder political figures. The films are not based on fantasy. You can scarcely imagine how delicate and easily manipulated the human mind is. The next time a hypnotist entertainer is in town, take in the show. This fuel valve business made me want to know more about hypnotism, so I went to see this guy, Mark Sweet. You would not believe it if you hadn't seen it. Only a handful of the people who volunteered and got up on the stage actually went under and were hypnotized, but those who were would believe anything this guy said and therefore do anything this guy asked. Here he tells 2 of them that their butts are glued to the seat and they can only free themselves by wagging their tongues around in the air. Believe me, if that bench had had an airline steering yoke attached to it and Mark told them to push it violently forward and then turn off the fuel control valves, they would have done it. After the show, we talked to them and their families. This was not a setup. But don't take my word for it. Go yourself. The CIA has been studying the potential of hypnotism to fulfill their requirements for mind control for 40 years. They would like you to believe that in 40 years they've learned nothing. Of course, they're lying. But how much is there to study? Using hypnosis, Mark can make a person do anything. The only difficulty, then, is that not everyone is easily hypnotized. You can bet, then, that the CIA spent the last 40 years messing with people's minds, trying to figure out how to hypnotize anybody they want. This guy was just fooling around. The CIA, however, was not. The CIA has conducted mind control experiments under the title MK Ultra for 50 years, many of them at this Canadian hospital. Here, the CIA's fascist scientist, Dr. Gottlieb, used all kinds of fancy techniques in his experiments.
They would use intensive electroshock and LSD and other disorienting drugs to, in his terms, de-pattern individuals, basically to wipe the slate clean. Second, using tape-recorded messages, try to program in new behaviors by repeating these messages hundreds of thousands of times, while the victim was immobilized with other drugs. And the final phase was to try to wipe the slate clean, so people could not, again, remember what had happened to them, but still have the new behavior.
All without getting permission from anyone.
It doesn't take long to figure out why the CIA or other intelligence agencies would be interested in such research.
Indeed. The goal of this program was to create Manchurian candidates, individuals who would go out and do whatever they had been programmed to do, including political assassinations, and who would remember nothing about their programming when their assignment was over. There is important and credible evidence that John Lennon's killer, Bobby Kennedy's killer, George Wallace's, and Ronald Reagan's would-be assassins were Manchurian candidates, victims of this kind of mind control. It seems, in fact, that after the fiasco of the murder of President Kennedy, which fooled only 20% of the population, the Manchurian candidate has become the method of choice used by these killers for removing those who get in their way. So what? So these monsters certainly have the capacity, the ability, the means to program people to kill themselves on an airplane full of people. The question is not can they? The question is, did they?